This is likely the most recognizable ringtone of all time, the nostalgic anthem of the early 2000s signifying the transition into the new mobile world. It was a time when Nokia was the most dominant cell phone manufacturer in the world. They controlled over 50% of the entire global mobile market, selling over 100 million phones every single year. This not only made them a mobile giant, but a corporate giant with a peak market cap of nearly $300 billion. But since then, it has only been bad news for Nokia. As smartphones entered the market, Nokia's annual sales fell off a cliff, down to less than 20 million phones per year. Their annual revenue collapsed even harder as it crashed from 60 billion down to just 6 billion. In fact, during the worst of it, they were losing $6 billion on an annual basis, meaning that their expenses were twice their revenue. Microsoft would try coming to the rescue as they bought out Nokia's business for $7.2 billion. But not long after, Microsoft would end up writing off the entire acquisition price plus more as a complete loss. And they would turn around and sell off the remaining parts of Nokia for just $350 million. But despite all of this, Nokia is somehow still around. In fact, they're still worth just over $20 billion. They've even re-entered the phone market after Microsoft left, and they're doing surprisingly well. Just last year, their smartphone sales tripled as the Nokia C100 became the 15th best-selling smartphone in the US. As such, they've been posting some of their best quarters in the last 15 years, pulling in nearly $5 billion per year. Of course, this is still a far cry from their once ubiquitous position in the market. But for a company that most would assume went bankrupt years ago, Nokia is actually doing quite well. In fact, you could even argue that Nokia is super undervalued as their PE ratio currently sits at just 5. So join me as we take a look at how Nokia has managed to not just stick around, but recover in the era of smartphones. Jumping straight into the beginning of the downfall, we have Nokia's apex year, 2007. This was the fateful year that the iPhone was announced, so it's not surprising that it was also the peak of Nokia, but it wasn't all doom and gloom. In fact, Nokia actually already had a foot in the race before the iPhone. In 2005, for example, they released a Linux-based mobile operating system called Memo, which they shipped with their Nokia 770 tablet. They were also relatively early to making touchscreen phones, the first of which they launched in October of 2008. But while Nokia had the right overall idea, they fell short from several aspects, starting with software. For the longest time, Nokia was always known for their hardware. They made some of the most durable and reliable phones on the market. In fact, people would often describe their phones as being bricks, and that was a compliment. But what Nokia didn't realize is that people were willing to sacrifice durability for functionality. Phones were rapidly evolving from being calling devices to being small computers, something that Nokia completely overlooked. As such, instead of embracing Android and coming out as the main competitor to iPhone, Nokia wasted their time making their own crappy OS called Symbian. Not only was Symbian clunky and lacking basic functionality, but more importantly, it had virtually no support from developers, meaning that users were more or less just limited to the in-house apps. But it wasn't just the software side of things where Nokia was lacking. Pretty soon, they were lacking on the hardware side of things as well. It seems that Nokia thought that hardware just meant durability, as they would completely neglect upgrading the internal components and specs. Just think about this. Nokia was literally selling phones that didn't even have 3G capability, while iPhones and Androids had already moved on to 4G. Yeah, it was really bad. Speaking of Androids and iPhones, Nokia also dropped the ball when it came to branding their smartphones. Apple and Samsung hit this out of the park with the iPhone and the Galaxy branding, but when it came to Nokia, there really was no branding. I mean, just listen to these names. Nokia 5800 Express Music, Nokia 603, Nokia 701, Nokia 808 PureView. Like, what does 808 even mean? Personally, I have no idea, and I think this is how most consumers felt as well. Nokia probably felt that the Nokia name itself was enough to appeal to customers, which brings us into our next pitfall: overconfidence. Nokia largely overestimated the value of their brand, and it's not surprising why. They were basically synonymous with cell phones. But this was actually a massive disadvantage. The key point to note is that Nokia was synonymous with cell phones, not smartphones. So, if anything, Nokia needed to work extra hard to shift away from this association with brick phones. But they ended up doing the exact opposite, as they let this association drive customers to Samsung and Apple. So, to sum things up, Nokia was extremely overconfident while they dropped the ball on software, hardware, and branding. But just as things were looking worse than ever in the early 2010s, they would see a glimmer of hope from Microsoft. You see, it wasn't just Nokia that had missed out on the smartphone revolution. Someone else that had missed out and was desperate to make their way back in was Microsoft. As such, these two would decide to join forces and take on the smartphone industry together. The first step in this partnership was letting Stephen Elop, a Microsoft executive, take the reins on Nokia. In late 2010, Elop would join Nokia as their first non-Finnish CEO, and just a couple of months later, they would ink a deal with Microsoft to become their primary smartphone partner. Elop justified this gamble as a Hail Mary that Nokia had to do to survive, but really, he had just signed their own death sentence. The problem with the Microsoft partnership was that it solved absolutely none of Nokia's fundamental issues. Take software, for example. Windows Mobile wasn't a revolutionary OS that was designed from the ground up for touchscreen handheld devices like Android or iOS was. Windows Mobile was really just a janky touchscreen version of Windows. As such, developer support was abysmal, meaning that Nokia made almost no progress on the software side of things. In fact, you could even argue that they made negative progress as they would start supporting Bing and Bing Maps. Things didn't look all that much better on the hardware side of things either. Microsoft was mainly just a software partner, meaning that hardware was still largely up to Nokia. And as such, Nokia would continue to drop the ball when it came to hardware. The Lumia 630, for example, only had 512 megabytes of RAM, no 4G, no flash, no selfie cam, and a 480p resolution screen. And they had the audacity to launch this in mid-2014, just before the launch of the iPhone 6. It's really no wonder why things didn't work out, but despite this, their combined overconfidence was higher than ever, as Microsoft was even more overconfident than Nokia. In fact, they would even go as far as staging a fake funeral for Apple. Yeah, that aged really well. The one thing that Nokia actually improved upon was their branding. The brand Lumia was far better than just labeling their phones the 603 or the 808. But given that nothing else improved, neither did Nokia's position. Under Elop's leadership, Nokia's stock price crashed 62%, their mobile phone market share halved, their smartphone market share fell from 33% down to 3%, and the company lost 4.9 billion euros. To make things even worse, it seems that Elop was more concerned about saving himself instead of saving Nokia. Instead of pivoting to Android or even just expanding to Android, Elop would use the last leverage that Nokia had over Microsoft to force them into an acquisition. Microsoft, whose options were to either give up on the phone market right then and there or spend $7.2 billion to have one last chance, would choose the latter. Honestly, this was a really smart play by Elop for himself, as he would return to Microsoft as an executive after dropping the ball completely with Nokia. But the same could not be said about Nokia. Just because Nokia had forced Microsoft to take the plunge didn't mean that Microsoft suddenly had a better strategy. In fact, remember the Lumia 630 that they launched right before the iPhone 6? Well, that was after Microsoft took over. Yeah, I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that after such failures, Microsoft would end up neglecting the phone business for a few years before shutting it down completely. The silver lining about all of this was that Microsoft didn't buy out the entirety of Nokia. If they had, the entire brand would probably be gone by today. But luckily for Nokia, Microsoft only bought out the phone portion of the business. But with that being said, this was their main business, so Nokia was still left in a pretty bad situation. All they had left was their network business, but looking back, this may have actually been a blessing in disguise. You see, selling off their phone business forced them to figure out a way to survive without their hero product, and that's exactly what they did. They poured all of their resources into revamping their network business and fixing all of their previous mistakes. For example, remember how they were previously neglecting 4G? Well, Nokia would become the first to demonstrate a 5G-ready network in 2016. They also stopped relying so heavily on the Nokia brand because, well, enterprise customers care way more about value pricing and results over branding. And as for their overconfidence, this was naturally completely gone as they were literally fighting for survival. None of these moves returned Nokia to their former heights, but it did salvage the business. By 2017, Nokia would return to the Fortune 500 as they solidified their position as the world's third largest telecommunications equipment manufacturer, only beaten out by Huawei and Ericsson. And this recovery would be just in time for Nokia to return to the phone business. You see, after Microsoft gave up on the phone business, they would sell off the remaining parts of Nokia for $350 million. This consisted of two parts. The first was the brand rights to Nokia, which were sold to a couple of Nokia executives who created a new company called HMD Global. The second was the manufacturing and distribution side of Nokia, which were sold to Foxconn. Shortly after this deal, HMD Global and Foxconn would enter into an agreement to bring Nokia back to the phone market. And this time, Nokia didn't make the same mistake of partnering with Microsoft. Instead, they would partner with Google and bring the first Nokia Android to market in early 2017. To be honest, given how late they were to the market, it's unlikely that Nokia will ever challenge the likes of Apple or Samsung or return to their former glory. But that isn't to say that they can't have a smaller, profitable business selling affordable smartphones, which is exactly what they've done. In Q3 of 2021, for example, they were able to ship almost 3 million smartphones. So on an annual basis, they're selling about 10 million smartphones, which again is only a tenth of what they used to sell. But considering the disaster they went through with Microsoft, this itself is quite impressive. So circling back to the question of the day of how is Nokia even still around? Well, after getting their butt kicked by Apple, Samsung, and Google and losing their business to Microsoft, Nokia returned to the business world as a humbled company. Instead of trying to recapture what they once had, they decided to focus on salvaging what they still had by focusing on networking equipment. And when Microsoft eventually gave up on Nokia, some of Nokia's executives decided to revitalize the brand and become a small but successful player in the modern smartphone world, instead of not being a player at all. And that's how Nokia managed to stick around. This story is completely different from Microsoft's perspective. If you'd like to hear their side, check out this video. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.